Okay, we are now live.
Okay. This is Senate Appropriations, and our first scheduled testimony is from the Commissioner of Finance and Management. And Hardy, are you the deputy? I want to get your title correct.
Budget Director, Madam Chair.
Okay, Budget Director. And we're going to be taking testimony on the budget adjustment. It's currently in House Appropriations. As I mentioned yesterday, their goal is to have it on the floor for vote the 20th and 21st of this month. So we want to get started on the testimony and the proposal. And so we have Commissioner Gresham here today to give us a walkthrough, and then we have more detailed testimony scheduled from the individual agencies and departments as we move forward. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Commissioner, and I don't know if you have screen sharing or how you want to do it, but to walk us through the highlights of the governor's proposed budget adjustment, which I gather is much greater than our normal budget adjustment of just going in and adjusting for actual versus estimates.
That is correct. It is. So we sent two documents, Madam Chair. Chrissy, I believe, distributed them.
Yeah,
And
she did. We have this. We have the spreadsheet.
right.
Right here. Is that the document?
That's right. Yep. And then we have also a language document. So there's a spreadsheet and there's language.
And the language.
Right. So I thought we might I think going line by line in the spreadsheet, you may agree, Madam Chair, would be somewhat time consuming and probably not the best use of our time. But I thought what I would do is just hit some highlights of stuff that I think you should be aware of. And then, if that raises questions, we can certainly be more detailed.
That sounds fine to me.
So
for those of
okay.
us who printed it off, we need a magnifying glass to see some of those lines. So if you hit the high points, and then the departments can come in on something that's smaller, but if some of these are relatively minor in the scheme of things.
Right. So, I'd start off simply by saying that, to your point earlier, Madam Chair, I mean, this is a somewhat more than, it's an unusual budget adjustment. The total size is $182 million. You probably don't have to go that far back in time to figure that used to be our entire budget. This year is our budget adjustment. We presented it in two parts several weeks ago. We presented the first part. Yesterday, we presented the second part. So I'm going to deal with it in its entirety. And I thought what I would do is just hit a few high points. As is true in most budget adjustments, a lot of it is housekeeping. And you see that particularly within our Human Services agency. There's a lot of money moving back and forth between federal and state and special funds. But I would point to a few things. One, as the committee's aware, the Emergency Board back in July increased the consensus Medicaid spending forecast by a substantial amount. So about $26 million of the general fund request is accounted for by Medicaid. And you see that in B301 and B307. That had to do with our increase in spending, which is largely a factor of not doing predetermined or redeterminations. So anyway, that is a fairly sizable chunk of our spending. Also within Human Services, and this will be a larger theme that we'll talk about in more detail later on in the presentation, but within Human Services, specifically within corrections and mental health, as well as the vets home. It's part of our effort to address workforce shortages. We've negotiated with the VSEA, shift differentials, retention bonuses, as well as hiring incentives. And in the case of corrections, we also instituted academy progression bonuses. So these new agreements are for corrections, the Vermont Psychiatric Care Hospital, as well as the Middlesex facility and the Vets Home. And those show up in lines B314, B338, and B342. And then I would also point out, sorry, are there questions?
Oh, Senator Sears?
Yeah, are there similar increases for those that contract with the state of Vermont that are suffering from the same problem, like our designated agencies are?
Right.
Or am I ahead of you?
Yeah, you are ahead. You will hear about those shortly. This is for our state employees. However,
I understood that,
yeah.
Adam, I just.
But we also have an incentive, retention incentive for our contracted designated agencies, long-term care facilities and the like that we'll get to in a moment. So
Thank you.
the final thing that's a little bit unusual that I wanted to highlight is one component of the governor's housing initiative shows up in B325. B325, that's within DCS. In addition to general assistance funding for out-of-town transports and funding for a continuation of the Rapid Resolution Housing Initiative, there is a $5 million proposal to seed a rental risk mitigation pool. And this will be contracted out by DCF. And the idea here is to incent landlords to work with us to get housing insecure Vermonters into homes. And as you might imagine, there is some risk for landlords in that. We're asking them to work with us. And we're also standing behind our request. We're setting up a rental risk mitigation pool, which will be available for landlords to apply to in the case of, I believe, up to $5,000 of damages that they may incur on their units. But again, this is an attempt to kind of crack the nut of transitional housing and to help find additional units and to get landlords to work with us on this. So that shows up in B325 under DCF. And I thought I would point that out. Are there questions on that or on Medicaid or also on the retention funding?
I don't know. Committee, any questions of, yes, Senator Baruth?
I'm just wondering, is the description of that rental risk program in the language?
It is not. That is something that DCF, I believe, will be ready and willing to speak to you on. That's something that they're pretty, interestingly enough, and this is the general fund component, $5 million component of an $80 million housing initiative, 75 million of which is in ARPA. And Commissioner Hanford at the Department of Housing and Community Development will be, I'm sure, in to speak with you on the remaining amounts. But you do notice further down, there are 3 different allocations to housing initiative, to VHCB, to VHFA, the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, as well. So anyway, but this is the general fund component of it. And the reason this is not in ARPA is we just didn't think a risk mitigation pool would be ARPA eligible. We thought that would kind of take us out the federal guidelines risk spectrum. So we put that into general fund, but this is part of a larger housing package that we'll speak about later.
Will, to follow up on Senator Brew's question, we know that landlords that they have reservations about renting to certain families because of maybe past history or whatever. And so having an entity sort of give them the insurance and assurance. But will we be getting a description? Because I think it's more than just finding a roof. It's also, even if you've got the rent insured or with this program, oftentimes they present problems or other issues that will result in the loss of their housing. And so you really have to combine it with fairly robust case management and support and oversight and supervision. So I think it's really good that you've given us the money, but I think knowing the complexity and the experience landlords have had with certain families, that to get them into permanent housing and assuring the rent is the first step, but keeping that even with with that financial assistance is perhaps in some cases going to be a challenge based on circumstances that we've had conveyed to our attention over the last few months. So the other question that I have when you're referencing the rental money for DCF, I know that we had a lot of rental assistance that came in, and there was some, Senator Westman and Senator Sears on joint fiscal helped me remember, but it was like 200 million, and there was a question as to whether Vermont could even begin to spend all that money. So is that the pot of federal money that you're referencing?
This would be additional to that.
Not the 5 million, but the federal money
Yes,
that you were, okay.
That is in addition to that.
Okay.
50 million of that will go to BHCB for mixed income that we believe is, one area, mostly multifamily, as you see on the sheet. And 20 million is going to support apartment rentals, and create existing properties that we hope will come online. But this is in addition to the money that we've deployed. This is
You're putting money into VHIP then?
We are. 20 million goes to VHIP, and that's to support affordable apartment creation. And what we're essentially taking a tact of doing everything that we can. In fact, maybe doing more than we can to try to crack the nut of providing affordable housing, not just for transitional housing, but for people who are starting out, young couples, people of middle income and the like. So this is in addition to, not substituting.
Senator Westman?
To just follow up on what Senator Kitchell brought up, that money that was set aside, the 200 for rental assistance, had a lot stricter requirements than they did in the initial monies that we got in 2020. And my question is, how much of that is out the door? And would that money be eligible to help with rental assistance, as you mentioned, the 20, if we haven't spent all of that 200?
I will get back to you on that. I think that's a good question.
I know that we were doing supplemental, because we could use it for a year. I think it was up to a year's rent. And so the Reach Up families got, they worked out a way of getting that group of households
but
money.
What that money that we did was income based. And
but Reach Up is well below the 80% median income. Yeah.
That's why they were eligible, but everybody having to verify their income, that big pot, it was a huge pot of money. Yeah. And I would think that if you're moving from a situation where you were homeless, you probably have the income that would fit right into that category. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll hear more,
Right.
obviously, from DCF when they come in.
Yes, and Josh Hanford again, I think, would be on this component, the ARPA component. I think he would
on the ARPA, but in terms of the risk of the rental risk fund.
Risk. Okay. The final comment I make on that is we did not plow this field. This field has been plowed by others. I mean, we've had some experience to draw on in other states and in other localities. So, I think that they have learned from other operators that have done this, but DCF will be able to tell you more.
Any other questions? Or we can move on to the other big pieces.
So further down, I was going to ask Hardy to hop in here. You'll notice an appropriation to VDOL, about $12.5 million for their UI program.
Happy to, Adam. So regarding VDOL, this is 100% related to UI program costs. So you'll probably recall that historically, UI program has been actually entirely federally funded in the past. And so this is, it's rather extraordinary to be having such a large general fund ask. You'll recall there was an explosion in UI program costs, and they really had to change their ways of doing business during the pandemic. And so FY21 saw contractor support for call center. They're still continuing to operate under that model with all of the call center functions really being outsourced. At the same time, they've actually had greatly increased internal staff costs. The internal staff is still occupied now, not as much with the claims processing currently, now that the claims have come down somewhat to more normalized levels, but there's still an enormous backlog of adjudication based on all the claims that are still ongoing. So what I engaged quite a bit with the department. They initially approached us, they started approaching us during the summer. And I'll admit we were skeptical at first, obviously expecting the claims volume to come down as the federal programs would be coming to an end. That so much greatly added to their caseload and case numbers in total. And that did happen in the fall, and the claims numbers of current claims have come down. The adjudication backlog still remains, and the new model, the service model also remains in terms of having the contractor support on the call center. The other thing that changed during the pandemic and is ongoing as part of their way of doing business is there were really, you're familiar, I'm sure you recall the computer system problems and the mainframe system problems, the backlogs that were created there and the bottlenecks. And so that led to investment in new IT systems. Well, they've still got that sort of mainframe backbone. The customer facing interfaces have changed quite a bit. There are licensing costs related to the Salesforce platform that's now being used by VDOL. There are also significant ADS internal support costs as well in terms of supporting IT systems. Number of the IT, modernization related costs are anticipated to be continuing. But to wind things back to, I guess, the BAA ask for 22, to put a finer point on it, in the 22 budget, there was $9 million budgeted for the UI program. At the same time as all of these increases in expenditures, VDOL actually saw a decrease in the federal funding coming their way in FY22 of $1.1 million. So that's reflected in the federal funds column on the BAA. So, but back to the underlying costs driving this ask. The federal funding they are now anticipating of $7.9 million wouldn't even cover the VDOL internal staff costs, let alone which are now projected around $9 million for FY22. On top and on top of that, they've also got hundreds of thousands of dollars just in admin costs like mailing and telephone service internally. And then on top of that, we start adding ADS, IT, and then the call center contract costs. And that's what is running up their tab basically to actually over 26 million is what they're anticipating for the 22 program costs. So applied against that are the 7.9 of federal funds. We also redirected, Finance and Management redirected $5.5 million of coronavirus relief funds, the lion's share of what we knew we had left closing out the year. And that's still, leaving this gap of 12.8. And what I can say is I did engage quite a bit with the department, my team and I, in order to kind of double check their numbers and try to prove out that these were real, because they really were quite remarkable. And we were able to confirm that if VDOL continued spending at the current rate, at the current level, this is the need for 22. And so I'll pause there and take a moment for comment or question.
I do have one question. Well, it's rather surprising that the federal support is actually declined in this environment. But second of all, as you referenced, this has traditionally been covered by federal funds. Are you asking for general fund because this is not a permissible use for ARPA, or is this a deliberate choice to use general fund versus ARPA?
That's a good question. It's a deliberate choice based on our general fund position. I don't believe we have received in-depth analysis of eligibility for all the components. So I know certainly CRF was applied, and that's what helped make up the gap in fiscal 21 and why there wasn't general fund applied there. I can't speak to whether or not all the costs are eligible.
Okay, by that you're talking about the contractors, the call centers, the additional administrative costs to serve the UI beneficiaries.
That's right. I'm just saying I can't speak to the eligibility question, and we've approached it as a general fund ask, which is how it originated.
Okay, well, it's interesting. Department of Labor, it's requesting general fund.
I mean, to be fair, Madam Chair, they're requesting funding. They didn't necessarily say general fund. It was Finance and Management and the governor's office. And, this, I think you'll hear as a general theme going forward in our presentation, as well as throughout the session. The governor has very strong desire to keep ARPA for longer term change agent transformational projects. We're really much less interested in deploying ARPA for COVID response, in part because many of the COVID, emergent response money has come from the CRF, and a fair amount of it is still coming from the federal government, not CRF. But our feeling on ARPA is we should try to use that for big projects like broadband and climate and economic development and water and sewer and the like that can make differences long term. So we really did not consider using ARPA for that. So that wasn't a Department of Labor thing, though. They were just looking for help, and we were the ones who came up with it.
All right, that's helpful. I'm sure that request was just, we need help.
That's exactly
as opposed to other questions about this. We're obviously going to have some more testimony. Also, I know that they've got a backlog of adjudications. We hear from people on occasion who have had claims for way back months ago, and some of them really have to be sort of dealt with individually based on the facts, and denial for not filing a timely claim when you couldn't get in the portal, and and so it's been difficult for many people to apply. Other questions on that? Okay, then we can go to the next highlight.
So moving on, there's a small appropriation from the Ed Fund, a small 1.5 million appropriation to the various career and technical education centers. This is, we think, a modest use of what is a substantial surplus in the education fund. Many of these centers have operational cost challenges. The governor here is just trying to throw them some relief. Some of these centers receive federal ESSER money, depending on whether their school district sent it to them or not. The three independent centers did not receive ESSER money, but this is a move to just provide some operational relief, and it will be doled out on a pro rata basis. In other words, the districts, the centers that have more pupils will receive a larger allotment. The centers that have fewer pupils will receive a smaller allotment, but it'll be done on a per pupil basis.
Okay, I see Senator Baruth.
Just wondering, Commissioner, you mentioned the three that haven't gotten anything so far. Will they start by getting something and then it'll be per pupil, or will they just start from the same line as everyone else now?
We're thinking from the same line.
Can I ask
This-
why
this-
that would be?
This was the hope of providing offsetting some operational costs. It was not an attempt to provide, call it surplus support, which is something that is still possible, and we're willing to consider it. But this, we wanted to dole out on a pro rata basis.
I think we'll have, to be honest, more discussion about that. We've heard from the three independents that got nothing and are really struggling, as opposed to others that got something. And so their operational and their financial situation, actually, they would believe, and they're making the case that it should be the former version, and that is they get something that's equivalent to what others got, and then maybe the balance on the pupil basis. But we'll hear more. And we know that there are three independents that are involved here, and I believe one is in Senator Nitka's district, and one is in Senator Sears' district, I believe, and maybe the
one's in
third is
Addison, I
in
think.
Addison. We think it's Hannaford, maybe.
Yes.
So your hands up, Senator Sears.
You're muted.
I'm unmuted now. I just I think everybody said what I was going to say and raised the issue. But I think from their point of view, it's just kind of an accident of history. They were independent rather than the other format of government. And, there may have been reasons to do that a while back, but it shouldn't penalize them from receiving some of those funds.
Particularly when we're talking about state funds.
Right. And it's kind of disappointing that we've got all this money coming to the towns now, and I'm not sure the schools that are independent school districts are going to benefit from that.
So I would note that in the December 1st letter that the tax commissioner writes to give kind of the first glance at what we're facing in terms of property taxes and ed fund, there was a balance of around $90 million on the bottom line. The governor kind of forecasting where he would like to deploy that. Half of it he would like to deploy towards workforce training and CTE centers. So, I suspect that the administration would be more than willing to work with the legislature to try to help, the CTEs do their jobs. So this is not the last we've heard in that regard, but I did want to point out that we're familiar with the challenges of the CTE centers, and we hope to work with them to help out.
So
Thank
just,
you.
can I just add
Senator
one?
Nika?
The problem is basing it on the student count, which I think you said you were going to do. What year would that be from? Because they couldn't recruit any students. And also there was a transportation problem. So a lot of kids didn't choose to go there. So their counts are way down also in the three that I know about. So that's just another issue to look at, that they need something greater than the other centers. So just for FYI.
You know, one of the things, and I'm certainly the governor referenced it, but was a priority when we built the budget last year. And that was the investment in individual Vermonters, human capital. And so we did put in quite a bit of money on that side or that in that particular area of spending. And certainly, I think everybody's talking about in the governor's speech around the importance of trades and skills. And yet we have a funding situation that has been in place for a long time that actually has financial disincentives for schools to send their school students to the CTE centers.
Right.
So perhaps, well, this is going to take some attention. And I don't know if the governor's budget that we're talking about actually proposes something to address that disincentive, because it's a really valuable and important resource to Vermonters, both our youth and adults. But it's been sort of the stepchild of the whole system in terms of how it's been funded. So I think we've articulated support of CTE, but we've absolutely done very little to address the fundamental financing structure for that part of our educational system. And maybe this is a year to grab hold of it, because I think we need to put our money where our mouth is. If we truly believe in the value of CTE and the training that it provides, both for adults can go, and there's been partnerships with VSAC and so forth for programs like CDLs or others. We really need to encourage and actually express, if we really value that piece of our educational structure, then we really have got to finally tackle what it means to fund it in a way that is predictable and not caught up in the financial disincentives that have been in place for, I don't know, for years.
Madam Chair, Senator Ballant, I could not agree more. Could not agree more.
And I know that there's been a tendency to denigrate tech ed, and that's unfortunate. I know that, schools like to say we had X percent go to the Ivies or go into this particular area or whatever, but those are critical occupations, and we've got to remember that we have Vermonters with different interests and really have a valuable skills. So we'll look forward to the workforce, because we put forward, we thought, a pretty robust package last year in the budget between the community college opportunities for recent grads to upskilling to last year we put in money for this new collaborative with Youth Conservation Corps, Vermont Works for Women, Resource Vermont, and Audubon. So we certainly are, I think our concern and our value on this is well established, but the CTE situation, I don't know, it just seems like if we want to do something transformative and get the best benefit out of that system out for the future, I think now there couldn't be a better time. So we can keep going on that, but I think 1.5 million, that's Ed Fund money. So that's going to also initiate a larger discussion on the use of Ed Fund, because this isn't general fund that's being proposed here.
And I think that the idea behind that, Madam Chair, is that the CTE centers receive their money, the lion's share, if not all of their money, from the ed fund. So we didn't want to change fund flows there. We wanted to provide them support from where they're typically supported. So,
Okay.
We looked at this as the norm.
All right, that's helpful. Thank you. In terms of the 1.5.
Right.
Um,
And-
other comments or, yes, go ahead, Commissioner.
I was just going to move on if there were no other questions on that.
Oh, that's what I was going to suggest, because I don't see anybody with their hand up. So we'll move to your next proposal.
So the next proposal that I wanted to highlight was in our first kind of look at the budget adjustment several weeks ago, but it kind of bleeds into a presentation we just made yesterday. And that has to do with the retirement of our TIB outstanding bonds. And Hardy, did you want to talk about that?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Adam. So this is actually described down in the transfer section below the appropriation section. So the last section on the second page of the worksheet, hopefully you've got it on a screen, because if it's printed on an 8.5 by 11, it's really hard to read. I acknowledge that. So in the second line of the transfer section, and also in the language, we're proposing a transfer from the transportation FHWA fund to the TIB debt service fund of $12.5 million. And what's happening there is we're actually able to use federal funds that have been received to help pay down our existing bonded debt, the transportation infrastructure bonds. And that $12.5 million amount was available. So what we have proposed doing is using those federal funds combined with, you'll see in the next line, 4.8 approximately million of T-fund dollars, but actually it nets out to be only about $1 million of net T-fund payout, because we've got a very unusual situation this year of actually being able to revert $3.9 million back to the T fund, which is a reversion from the state police. So from the 20 some odd million that's typically contributed from the T fund to state police. Not all of that was needed, and not all of that was needed due to large amounts of CRF and other federal funds utilized by the state police. So for really only about $1 million layout, all of the outstanding bonded TIB debt can be retired. And I guess what's exciting about that is that is worth, as I recall, something like $2.5 million in annual, debt service payments. So what that will do is help.
Does this pay it down, or does it retire what we have?
It's retiring.
Totally.
Yes, it's retiring on this. For the TIB bonds, we're retiring totally. And so what this will also do then is provide in the out years, as we're expected to be eligible for receipt of a greater amount of federal funds, but that will require state match component. This helps create a source of state match for future federal funding.
Yeah,
So,
we've had an estimate of over 100 to 127 million would be required for match on the for the transportation piece. Okay, so that sort of gets that fiscal house in order, frees up the money that would ordinarily go for debt service and makes it available for match.
it does. It
Sounds very familiar, doesn't it, Commissioner?
Does indeed. I would note also, this year was not our fear. We had enough on the bottom line from past years carry forward and the like, but it was the 24, 25, 26 where we were kind of scratching our heads saying, okay, what do we do? So this is really, and I just think it's a great thing to do anyway. We have an unusual situation where federal money was available, and so.
Okay. All right.
This is a real
Just
good
committee,
idea.
the Senate Transportation Committee is going to take testimony on the transportation related pieces of the budget adjustment and give us their views around what's being proposed. That'll be next week too.
Well, I think this is a really good idea. We can't use federal money to match federal money in the infrastructure bill, but we can use this money to pay down the debt and then use this fund to
Mhm.
match.
Right.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
It should be all worn out by the time we've trotted it around.
Well, you know, we're going around the horn here, but it's a good deal.
Mhm, mhm.
Uh,
Through our proverbial washing machine, as we call it. Okay. So Senator Westman likes that, even though he was the, I think, one of the driving forces behind the creation of the whole TIB concept.
huh.
Just to put some historical perspective on
Well,
his
yes.
comments.
Yes,
Longtime
and,
chair of the House Transportation Committee.
well, and we also used the TIB bond fund for match during Irene. And so we've been able to use that for match when we've had big jolts of money at least twice before. And this fits right into that same line.
Right. Well, I guess so that's met with universal applause. We'll see what comes next.
I'm sure all the rest of it will too.
Mm,
So I think maybe that this is a good opportunity to move to the what I would call a related item, albeit certainly not TIB item, but there was an initiative that we presented yesterday to House Appropriations to retire $20 million of outstanding general obligation bonds. These bonds are $20 million out of a total of approximately $80 million of general obligation bonds that are callable. You know, that's a subset of our general obligation bonded debt. Approximately 80 million are callable, which means that we can retire them on our choosing. Generally, a callable bond is issued for a period of, say, 5 years, after which it becomes callable over the remainder of its life. So we have outstanding bonds that are callable. We are asking to call them and retire them. Now, I will say that it's typical that higher coupon callable bonds we do anyway, but typically we call them, retire them, and then reissue lower coupon bonds. Here, the proposal is a little different in that we're proposing to call them and not reissue. So for all intents and purposes, we're looking to reduce our general obligation debt by $20 million. We are doing this, and the reason I said it's somewhat related to TIB, you know, when you take the $22 million TIB retirement and $20 million of general obligation bond retirement, we're taking a decent dent out of our overhead, out of the state's debt service. And also we're looking to do this now because historically we've gone to market in the spring with general obligation bonds, which means credit rating agencies will be typically reviewing our credit and our numbers, our ratios and the like in the spring, March, April. So the timing of this is meant to coincide with that rating and hopefully have a couple of feathers in our cap. But also, you know, I want to point out that the governor has been very clear, and I know the legislature has shared this. We have some demographic challenges, and the rating agencies have pointed to that on a regular basis, saying your debt outstanding is growing, albeit slowly, but your workforce and wage earners are shrinking, albeit slowly. So that's just not a good combination. And so we're very focused on reversing the demographic issue, but we're also, I think it's prudent to focus on reducing our debt outstanding. So anyway, that proposal will be coming at you, or has come at you as of yesterday.
That was on Stephanie's list. She did it in blue to alert us to what you brought in. to House Appropriations.
Okay. Questions on that, or should I move on?
I think, I don't see any questions, so why don't you just keep going?
Okay. So there's one additional, what I would call kind of housekeeping or balance sheet item that we brought to the legislature yesterday, and that was that, as this committee is probably aware, the state has carried a $20+ million deficit in our property management. The chair and Senator Starr, perhaps, and Sears may have been around when these buildings were purchased years ago, which led to part of the deficit. But the property management fund, as of the close of our fiscal year in June, had a $21.6 million deficit. That deficit has two components. The first component was developed, roughly $12 million of that is due to building purchases that were made back in the Dean administration. There were three buildings that were purchased: the Zampieri building in Burlington, the Asa Bloomer building in Rutland, and I forget the third building in St. Albans, which subsequently was sold. So we're really talking about two outstanding.
That's the one we gave away for economic development purposes.
May have been, but it's no longer on our books. That's not really a problem. However, when the buildings were purchased, they took out a 20-year mortgage, and they knew then that the payments on the lease payments from tenants in the building would not be enough to make the payments on the mortgage. So they essentially put in place a 50-year plan whereby the first 20 years would grow a deficit to pay off the buildings, then the next 30 years would pay that back. Yeah, I'm here to tell you that, somewhat to my pleasant surprise, that the plan is actually working. The mortgages were retired. The last payment, I think, was made in 2017. So the buildings are now owned outright. But that created, again, a deficit that I think at its peak was around $13 million due to the building purchases. And that has slowly receded. And it will continue to recede up until approximately 2048. But that part of the deficit, I think, is fine. There was another component of the deficit, which, again, this committee may remember, was created when the property management program did not have a revenue source behind it. So the leasing agents that worked in property management had nowhere to bill their salaries and benefits and the like. And so a deficit, again, in this fund built up over a series of about 15 years. In 2017, you may remember, we put a surcharge on tenants in leased buildings. And that was intended to pay for the administration of the property management program. I am here to tell you that it has. We are now running that program at cost. So that component of that deficit is not growing. And that is what is in front of you today. We would like to then, having stabilized the program, we would like to pay off that component of the deficit and reduce the overall fund deficit from 21.5 million to about 11.5 million. That 11.5 million, as I said, over the next 25 years will disappear. So that we have a plan for. I don't think there's a need to do anything, but the component of the property management fund that was built up because we weren't paying operational, the cost of administering the program, that's just sitting there. The good news is we're no longer running that deficit higher. We're paying for the cost of the program, but we're not paying enough so that we can pay costs and retire the deficit. This sits on our ACFR, our formerly called CAFR. Every year it's a note. Currently, I think on page 88 of this year's ACFR. And, it's just, our view is it's a black mark. It's the kind of thing that when you have no financial capacity, you deal with it. But it's, again, a kind of a credit rating issue. We're always asked about it, and I think it's just time to put this behind us. Again, it kind of coincides with, if we go to market in the spring, this will be one more thing we can say we're dealing with. So are there questions on that, Madam Chair?
Just looking, I don't see any hands.
Okay. Artie, did you want to launch into the, there's an initiative on cyber?
Sure, I'm happy to cover that now if you'd like, Adam. So there is an appropriation in the B1106 section on the worksheet. That's one component of this initiative, and it's actually related to a fund transfer that I'll also describe at the same time. So first of all, I'd like to kind of provide a little background on the origin of this initiative and also why it's germane to offer in the budget adjustment. So subsequent to passage of the FY22 big bill in July 21, we have a number of insurance policies for insurance coverage that's not self-insured by the state. Most of the policy renewals occur in July. And so in late June, we had a bit of an unpleasant surprise from our broker. And we had some unfavorable changes in coverage for several policies, but the most significant one being our cyber liability policy. And so to give you an idea, the magnitude of the change there, we formerly had, so in FY21, $10 million of coverage on the cyber policy, and it had a $250,000 deductible. And our cost for that policy was a little over $100,000 a year. The change that occurred at insurance renewal is the coverage was cut in half from $10 million to $5 million. Even more notably, though, the deductible was raised from $250,000 to $3.5 million. And for this policy, we're now being charged about 4 times, so over $500,000 now for this policy. And the broker was not able to find any other carrier other than our existing carrier who would even look at providing any coverage. So a lot of this has to do with changes in the cyber market, and I'm sure we're all aware of the kind of things we've heard about in the news over the past year and some odd amount of time, and the amount of the increase in cyber attacks exposure and some really big ticket claims, and it's not a line that the market is very, very interested in providing coverage on right now. But another component that we should cite as well was the carrier's assessment of the state's position in terms of cyber defenses, and identified some shortcomings, and in particular pertaining to systems for tracking and monitoring log activity. So this appropriation for $3.3 million to the Agency of Digital Services is really targeted at addressing the liabilities identified by the insurance carrier pertaining to information and event management. This appropriation is actually broken into 2 pieces: $2.3 million for purchase and implementation of the platform, and then another $1 million for ongoing operational and maintenance costs. That the $1 million of maintenance cost would facilitate implementation in FY22 and also cover the operation and maintenance in FY23. Beginning in FY24, this $1 million would be added to the ADS allocation and be distributed statewide. So that is.
Hardy, could you just clarify? In the figures you're giving, 2.3 for platform, 1 million for operations. And then is the premium, where does the premium fit? Is that an addition? Or
Sure.
is that...
So in my earlier discussion about the insurance coverage, I was just kind of setting the stage for identifying the need. So one of the reasons we faced, one of the contributing factors besides market conditions was some of the exposure identified by the carrier. But you're absolutely right, Madam Chair, is that we've still got this exposure, which is what in finance and management we particularly took note of, which is if we have a claim, where is the $3.5 million going to come from before we even enter into the 5 million of coverage? And then that'll only bring us up to 8.5. We used to have 10 million of coverage. What if the claim cost even exceeds that? So to that end, further down in the transfer section of the worksheet, we are also simultaneously proposing a $6.7 million transfer from the general fund to the state self-insurance, state liability self-insurance fund. And what that provides is a place to park some money as a reserve that could be utilized. It's statutorily permissible to be utilized to any liability claim. So that's a place to put the money if we do need it in the event we have a cyber event. I should add, there were other changes in our insurance coverage that weren't as significant as the cyber policy I'm mentioning, but there was also some unfavorable changes both in coverage and retention limit on excess non-tort liability policy as well. So we're considering so the 6.7 million transfer is not purely to address our cyber exposure. It's a combination of insurance factors, but cyber being the biggest driver. Does that answer your question, Madam Chair?
It does, but it raises the question. Obviously, insurers want to minimize risk, and so it's kind of interesting because the whole emphasis, and we put money in, ADS has requested money for security. We had the contract with Norwich, et cetera. And it's interesting. Well, maybe it's not surprising that with all that focus and additional, maybe that the insurer would come in and identify other things that we had not identified as part of that whole cybersecurity examination. Maybe they've got more expertise, but it seems like it's indicative that we need to do more, as opposed to coming in and reviewing and say, gee, we think you've got the security requirements well met or whatever. So it was just saying we had more to do, and what we'd done may have helped, but it didn't get us to the level that our insurer, gee, it's nice. Did the insurer charge us for this assessment? Because in fact, we'd probably pay a contractor a lot of money to tell us where we needed to make, enhancements. So I guess maybe that was worth something if they did it for nothing.
I think it's packaged into the premium cost.
Yeah, I'm sure we paid. Mm-hmm.
So
it's like the raincoat. It's in there somewhere. You find it.
Well, I certainly understand your comments, Madam Chair. I'm not in a position to really address IT security policy. I'd certainly encourage you to bring in the Agency of Digital Services, to learn more about the situation. As a layperson, though, I'd offer the comment that IT security, the field really seems like something of an arms race, and it's ever changing, and the threats are ever changing, and that may require ever changing responses.
Okay. Questions, committee? Other than you've explored other options, came up with no one else, and we've actually got to gig up the self-insured piece of the coverage.
So again, well, I'll offer some final comments, which are our broker at renewal actually looking at the change in value provided by this coverage. Our broker actually recommended considering self-insurance.
I was wondering that.
And so our risk management team is actively involved in exploring other options, including self-insurance, potential captive options. Could we combine efforts with other states? Because this is not a situation unique to the state of Vermont. And in fact, we're probably better positioned, you'll hear from ADS, in terms of our security efforts than many others. So it's really, this is not being driven by our deficiencies, but our approach is a combination of reserving additional funds ourselves, as well as mitigating risk and minimizing exposure however we can. But one of our thoughts in making the transfer to the self-insurance liability fund is, should we go the self-insured route, we'll already have started seeding the fund there. And and that is the location we would put additional funds for this purpose. We wouldn't necessarily.
And then purchase like a stopgap so that above a certain amount you're.
Exactly. And there are, and our broker is working with our risk management team on exploring different options for that. And that's likely, that's probably likely in the future. There's a likelihood of that. So starting to move in that direction now, made sense to us. Besides our need to have some reserve in case we do need to action a deductible by starting to seed additional funds in the self-insurance liability fund, that would be really where we end up moving cyber coverage if we move to a self-insurance option.
Where are the claims coming from that insurers have experienced when it involves state government systems?
I can only comment on the state's own experience, which is, I believe, only resulted in 2 claims, one of which, and the largest, was actually an inadvertent self-release of information, which was VDOL's UI program and the 1099 issue. And that was actually, so that's the kind of thing, even though it was an inadvertent self-release, that's the kind of thing that's covered by cyber liability. So we activated a claim, although we didn't exceed the deductible of $250,000 on that one. Prior to that, the only other claim I'm aware of was in the previous year. There was a claim involving the Agency of Transportation. I know it was around $167,000 of the cost to us. But that's all the commentary I can offer on the subject. I'm sure risk management and or ADS could provide additional detail in general on claims.
Okay, well, the Department of Labor, we knew that was just a matter of coding and it was a mistake, but it obviously compromised the security of people's data. So, all right, other questions on cybersecurity? All right, I'll keep moving.
On, Madam Chair.
Oh, it's 2:36. Chrissy, are we? I need to look at the agenda. Oh, am I way over time? Or
nope, you're all set. We have Dan Dickerson coming on at 3, so you do have time.
Okay, I thought we were supposed to have a break, but let's finish up.
So there's 2 more large appropriations that you should be aware of. The first, both of them are directed at the Agency of Human Services. The first of which is a $25 million proposal to appropriate to Human Services to be really kind of the frontline emergent needs response funding. You'll recall, I'm sure, the Coronavirus Relief Fund was the fuel behind our early and primary response to COVID. And that fund wasn't obviously exclusively to put to work in healthcare. However, on a net basis, about $175 million was in fact put.
You're talking about the Provider Stabilization Fund?
Provider Stabilization Fund. So about $175 million went there. You're also aware that Coronavirus Relief Fund is no longer. Human Services has obligated all that funding, and in fact, most of it is out the door. So this $25 million is intended to provide replenishment, and it's has a focus primarily on 3 areas. Subacute beds. I think you're probably familiar with their effort there, but they have located 7 different long-term care facilities. around the state, like the Mountain View Center in Rutland, Burlington Health and Rehab, the Newport Health Center, I believe, and 2 or 3 more. And they're trying to find beds that they can put formerly acute but no longer ICU needy patients who are recovering and can be moved from ICUs into other settings. The whole idea is to open up beds in the hospitals. So there's been a big focus on that. And what we're doing there is we are taking cold beds in these facilities and we're making them warm by paying the delta between what might be called a normal market rate for staff for nursing and the elevated rate, which predominantly from contracted travelers. So we're trying to encourage facilities to open up beds, and we're trying to make it so that the cost is not penal to them.
So the secretary had added 80 beds using this mechanism. Would
Yes.
This fund continue and add more beds, or is
Yes.
this
There's
both?
currently about 100 and I want to say 40 beds that have been open and available and in use. So we have added. I think initially the secretary was looking at 3 facilities. I think that has expanded to 7 facilities. So there's now more beds available. So that's really the first focus. The second focus is kind of along the same lines, only this time opening up more capacity in ICUs. And there again, we're supporting contract staff to increase the bed capacity in the same light. So, I'd emphasize this is precautionary, where we're not out of ICU space, but, no one knows the course of this virus, and we may come to the point where we really do need more ICU space. So we've all read the terrible news about people being transported 2-3 hours from hospital to hospital for availability. And so we're trying to get ahead of that by providing more ICU space. And then finally, we're also trying to provide, or we're putting aside money to provide financial support to providers to prevent disruption of service, which is another way of saying we can't afford to lose a bed. So we have to make sure that all of our healthcare facilities remain viable. And to the extent that they need financial support, we want to be able to do that to keep all our beds active. A final comment I would make on this before opening it up for questions is that we've asked, you'll see in the language document that we may or may not have a chance to go through, we've asked for some flexibility in the use of these funds, as we had actually with CRF, for the Commissioner of Finance to work with the Secretary of Human Services to the extent that we have needs that are emergent or we didn't anticipate or are more expensive than we thought, we would be able to move around this 25 million within the agency to make sure we meet the needs. So you'll see some flexibility language that we proposed in the language section of the document. And then finally, within Human Services, I wanted to answer the point or the question that Senator Sears and others had brought up, and that is what have you available for assistance to the many different healthcare providers. So there is a $15 million initiative that Human Services is behind that would provide essentially workforce retention incentives. And that's really in a nutshell what it is. And Hardy, do you want to launch into that?
Sure, I'm happy to add a little bit of color. One of the key elements of this program is it's really targeted to non-hospital staff and really all the other positions in the healthcare universe. So home health, skilled nursing facilities, residential care providers, direct service workers such as nurses, direct support professionals, and independent workers as well. I understand that there may be an application process to consider applications from some critical hospital providers, but that's really not the target of this focus. And it's really to try to catch catch staff who have really kind of fallen through the cracks. Well, other aid packages and provider stabilization monies have been deployed. What I understand in the current proposal, as far as the nuts and bolts, are AHS is considering bonus packages up to 15% of base pay, or $7,500, and making the payments contingent on a service agreement. So for some period of time, 12 to 24 months, providing this kind of financial amount and making it dispersed through quarterly payments over the period of time of the service agreement. The types of employees of the types of facilities that might be recipients are everything from mental health providers like a Clara Martin Center, to a Burlington Health and Rehab, to adult day centers, and then and home health providers, as I understand it. So I'll take a pause there for question or comment, with the caveat that in terms of policy details, I probably can't provide too much more than I already have, and would welcome you to invite AHS. And I know Ina Backus has been very involved in the plan designs.
Senator Sears, I think you're probably interested in a DCF group homes.
Well, I'm interested in home health workers, DCF group homes, mental health, substance abuse workers. That runs the gamut. And I think the retention bonus is a great idea. They're also having a hard time getting employees. So while part of the problem is losing employees who decide to move to other places or actually stop working, it's also a problem of what the pay level is. I know my local mental health center was losing people to other positions, or people that just decided not to work anymore because they couldn't get childcare for their kids. So it was, it was difficult. School schedules were up in the air. So there were a number of reasons why people chose not to work anymore. So I wonder if there's going to be also in this plan increases in the hourly wages for many of these positions. That new for new hires. So that, and I have absolutely, I'm solidly behind the retention bonuses. I think they're a great idea.
If I could make a connection as well, Senator Sears.
Yeah.
We know that you're currently negotiating salaries with state employees. Right? The next contract. And we hear all the time in terms of the disparity between what gets negotiated for salary and salary increases for state employees relative to the funding that's made available to the community-based organizations that are carrying out and providing the services, which at some point in the past used to be provided by the state. So when we're negotiating for what we think is important for wage to attract the state workforce, I think the issues that we're hearing, and I think maybe I just want to maybe expand on what Senator Sears is saying, is we can't do that in isolation with looking at what are those wage structures and the ability for those service providers to compensate fairly and attract the staff that they need to, whether it's mental health or whether it's the group homes that replaced the week school, to you name it. So I'm in terms of looking at the budget and what we're looking at in salaries and what is justified in one area, to what extent is that translating in? Because these are, when you move it into salaries, you're talking about ongoing base commitment. And to what extent are we going to be seeing a reflection of the need to address those base levels for to the larger provider group, many of whom are really, their whole business is serving Vermonters and are funded almost entirely by the state budget. Is that, Dick, is that?
Yeah, no, that expresses very real.
Okay.
What I think the problem is. And
So-
it's not a new problem, but
No.
it's been exacerbated by the pandemic.
So, but maybe we'll see in the governor's budget the extent to which, when we're talking about maybe, certainly we want to be transformative, but at the same time, we've got to make sure that our basic foundations of services or responsibilities that are part of government's role in serving and protecting Vermonters are part of that shoring up. So maybe we'll get more detail when we get the budget, but I think we can be transformative in many ways, but we can't neglect those fundamental functions of government that are ongoing and need to be ongoing.
I think I understand the comments, and I'll offer that as far as the BAA ask for this particular appropriation, it's considered a short-term, immediate stop the bleeding
Yeah,
type.
I understand that, Hardy. Mhm.
And AHS is engaged in medium and longer term strategies, and this being a short-term, immediate one.
I understand, but it does translate into that longer term. And as we've talked about, when you start doing wage adjustments and so forth, to roll those back become very difficult. And so it's looking, what do we need to do short term? And really, what are the long term responses and implications for what we're doing right now? And if I were a nurse, which thank God no one would want me to care for them, I can tell you. And I'm working in a nursing home and I'm having a contract nurse come in whose salary is so much, you can't imagine the dynamics that this must be presenting in those healthcare environments. And, hospitals are losing nurses to go to be contract nurses. And as our CEO said, gee, we lost a nurse to go to Maine, but now we have a Maine contract nurse to replace her at, twice the salary. So it's becoming very perverse. And that's why, some of us have been really so adamant about we've got to increase the capacity of our educational programs to generate the number of and to accept the students who are capable, but they can't be admitted because our programs are limited and because we don't have the clinical placements developed. And if we don't deal with it at the end, we can throw all the chum in the water, but there's an inadequate supply. And we end up creating that perverse environment where you become a contract nurse, we hire them out of desperation, and we're paying so much more. And in the short term, you have to do that, but that's long term. The only way you can address it is actually expand the number of nurses that are graduated each year. And we've been trying to work on that, and we've seen some things happen with our state colleges or Vermont State College. But if all you're doing is competing with an inadequate supply, basic law of supply and demand, the cost is going up.
But can I just follow up on what you said? Last year, the American Nurses Association said 80,000 people applied to schools that were eligible that didn't get in because there wasn't placement.
80,000.
80,000 people applied in this country to become go to nursing school and couldn't get into school, and they were eligible. They had the grades and everything to do it. So we need to concentrate on increasing the pipeline.
So just so I'm clear, that the budget adjustment provides money for retention bonuses, for lack of a better term. And we're hopeful that something will be in the budget, 23 budget, to help deal with the crisis.
Which is
Okay.
ongoing, yeah. Mhm.
I mean, obviously, can't talk about the 23 budget today, but I
Well,
did.
what I can say, Senator, is that I think, not to get too far ahead of ourselves with the budget, but I think you'll find in the budget that there many of the themes that you talked about are addressed. You know, we hear you, the governor hears you loud and clear. You know, he's hearing from many of the same people, and we're well aware that we have a challenge. And so I think you'll see that we address this issue. You know, at core, the issue of rate, setting appropriate rates for our partner agencies that are carrying out a lot of these functions. I mean, we're going to give that a try. We're going to, you know, certainly provide them some additional financial horsepower. But two, we're well aware that we need to do something to attract, you know, not just nurses, but all healthcare providers, but particularly nurses. So all of this, I think you'll find in the budget in some shape. I don't want to say more than that.
Good. Well, no, understand. I appreciate the conversation. I think we're all
Right.
frustrated by it, whether we be part of the system and have people in need of care, or whether we're hearing from constituents, or the whole gamut.
So,
The situation.
Cardi, you had a comment?
I do have another comment that I think is relevant to the education discussion, which there is a smaller appropriation on the sheet that we haven't yet covered, which is an increase of 2.3 million to the Vermont State College's Critical Occupations Program. So that's related to an original $5 million appropriation.
Yeah, and we
that's
made a
been-
commitment that we would do that because they were
Right.
upfronting, they had such a good response, so.
And that does include nursing students are a big piece of that. We
Mhm.
understood from VSC, just
Yeah.
adding that to the discussion.
Mhm.
And-
Yes, and the take-up rate was so much higher, so we knew that we were advancing money that would be ordinarily used in the second semester. So
And-
I just gotta go disconnect my phone. Just a sec.
Go ahead. So what I thought in the, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, but I did want to point out two things, one of which we probably don't have to say nearly as much on as we did to the House, and that is the Green River Dam appropriation. I think Senator Westman will be very familiar with that. And so maybe, again, in the interest of time, we can skip over any detailed discussion, but there is a $350,000 appropriation to agency, the Department of Environmental Conservation, to carry out a study.
Are you talking about the Green River Dam?
Yeah.
Oh, that was Caledonia Home Health on the line.
Really?
Must be they're calling. They want to make sure that there's money in the budget. All right.
And there's a couple of smaller ones. There's a fix to the healthcare claims tax that was, mistakenly defunded, that we provide a fix to. There's also a fix that in the language section alone to get out a COVID CRF payment to a school district down, I believe, in Senator Nitka's area, Windsor Central, that, through a financial audit discovered they forgot to submit a claim. That's also in there. That's CRF.
Can we do that with CRF?
We can, because the costs were obligated actually
Obligated.
back in 2020.
Okay. Mhm.
And then I think, in terms of kind of hitting all the buttons, I think we've done that. There's quite a bit more in the language that may interest you, and we're certainly available to come back at your leisure to expand. But I think Hardy, we hit all the high points.
We did. There's some substantial increases to some of the housing initiatives that were already existing appropriations, as well as one new housing initiative, the missing middle home ownership development pilot. So I'm sure you'd be interested in hearing more from ACCD.
Well, we'll be taking more detailed testimony. I'm looking at, it's nearly 3:00 and we've been here. I'm going to suggest that we just take Dan is probably in the waiting room. He's supposed to come in at 3. And then we have the Agency of Transportation at 3:30. So I don't know about you, but I could probably use a 10-minute break.
Yeah.
Could we please let Dan know that we will be back at 3:10? Please be back at 3:10 so that we can keep finishing up pretty much on time for today. And thank you very much, Hardy and Adam, for your presentation and the information. And we'll just take a brief 10-minute break and then come back.
Okay,
Thank
and
you.